Greetings! Welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for another video on tree propagation. Now, we've talked about several methods up to this point. We've rooted some cuttings, we've started some seed. Today we're going to talk about air layering. Now, this is a vegetative propagation technique very similar to the rooting of cuttings, but it has a couple of extra twists that will allow you to root larger cuttings and to work with species that are a little bit more recalcitrant when it comes to growing from regular, snip, cut, and dip cuttings, okay? So this is just an example of one of the trees that I'm propagating by this method. This is a lovely, lovely crab apple that's self-seeded along one of the field rows on the farm where I grew up, and I want to grow some of these at our home farm up in New York. So I'm going to show you first the methodology, why it works, how it works, and what you do, and then take you around, show you some examples of things that I'm working with via this method this spring, and hopefully generate some ideas in your mind on how you can use this on your own farms. So let's dig in. We have a stump, and the stump is going to help us learn a little bit about woody plant anatomy, and this is important knowledge if you want to understand how to set up a cutting or to properly set up an air layering. Okay? Now, the stem of the tree does a couple things. One is it provides physical structure so that the leaves can get up and get altitude and go access the sun and compete for it. Okay? It also provides an attachment between those leaves and the roots, and communication between the leaves and the roots. A tree always wants to have its biggest, most actively growing root right underneath the biggest, most actively growing branch, and that's under hormonal control. Okay? The branch is going to produce sugars and metabolic products and hormones and all that sort of stuff, transport that to the root. The root is going to gather water and nutrients and transport that up to the branch. But just like the growing branch produces a root-stimulating hormone, the root produces a branch-stimulating hormone. Okay? All of those things are important. Control of that hormonal flow and water flow is what allows an air layering to work. So we need to know where all of those functions take place in the stem. Okay? Now, a little bit of hollow, that doesn't matter. The inside of the trunk is inert. The wood, right, from where my thumbnail is down into the middle, this is all called the xylem tissue. It's dead cells. They're just basically soda straws pushing water up. But the only ones that are actually pushing water up are the outer edge, the sapwood. In this one, it's a little hard to see because the heartwood isn't really dark. But you can kind of see a color gradient here, where this is a little bit more white and this is a little bit more pink. This region that's a little bit more white is the sapwood. Okay? Now, these are the soda straws pushing water up. That's all they do. They don't shuttle any of the fun chemistry. They don't transport sugars. They don't transport hormones. They'll transport a little bit of dissolved nutrients, but even most of the nutrients are happening in the next layer we're going to talk about, which is the inner bark. Okay? We have inner bark and outer bark. The outer bark is just the cork, and that's just there to waterproof the trunk. Okay? The inner bark is phloem tissue. Phloem cells are living cells actively choosing whether or not to shuttle a substance up or down. Okay? They are where you're going to have all of this hormone flow take place and what's going to allow the sugars to go from the top down. Okay? That all happens in the phloem. The outer bark, again, is dead cells and is inert. So the hormone communication, inner bark, water, the sapwood. That's going to be very, very important. Now, the last thing that's going to be very, very important here is the idea of undifferentiated cells. This is kind of like stem cells in animals, but we don't call them stem cells in plants. But the undifferentiated cells are a subtype of parenchyma, which is able to become any other type of plant cell depending on the hormone signals that it has been provided. Okay? So there's two layers of cambium here, which is one of these undifferentiated cell types. You have the vascular cambium in between the xylem and the phloem. Okay? and then you have the cork cambium in between the cork and the phloem. And these are the layers which will sometimes look green when you peel a stem. That's the cambium. So those are undifferentiated cells. They're able to produce these other cell types which are either dead, like the xylem or the cork, or so highly specialized they can never divide again and become another of their same cell type, like the phloem. Okay. Now, the third region of undifferentiated cells is the ones that we're really going to use to make roots, and they're called lenticels. I'm going to go take you to a living tree and show you what they look like. This tree is a fire cherry. It's a really interesting tree. They're called fire cherry because they're one of the few serotinous or fire-dependent trees here in the East Coast. Their seeds have to get really, really hot before they'll germinate. You usually find them along roads like this. You can see the road there in the background, because the seeds that fall right in the road berm get hot enough from the sun hitting the macadam to make them think that they've been through their fire and allow the seeds to germinate. Anyway, there's your fun fact about this tree, but the reason we're looking at it is because it has really prominent lenticels. Remember, lenticels are the third type of undifferentiated tissue that we're dealing with when we're doing air layerings. And again, because it's undifferentiated, it can become anything. Now, what these lenticels do is basically allow the tree to breathe through the bark. The bark is full of a wax called suberin. It's completely waterproof. So these little lenticels are an opportunity for the tree to exchange gases a little bit across the bark. It kind of breaks that barrier up a little bit. But what we care about is that those lenticels are undifferentiated tissue. Because of that, when we accomplish the hormonal change that we're about to accomplish in the process of making our air layering, it can receive that hormone signals, sense the change in hormone signals, and become root tissue. And it's these lenticels that are going to become our adventitious roots. Those are sapsucker scars. Ignore them. I'm looking at these oval ones here in the middle. Okay. Now, the additional thing I'll say about these is when you see trees and shrubs with prominent lenticels, it's a good sign that that is a good candidate for cutting or air layering propagation techniques. Doesn't always guarantee success, and just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. There's a lot of trees and shrubs that germinate very, very nicely from cuttings that you can't see the lenticels. There's also an even larger number of trees and shrubs where you can see the lenticels as little tiny pale dots on one-year-old twigs, and then they get overgrown and you can't see them anymore. But since I like to show big on camera because it's easy for you to see, I wanted to bring you to this tree to illustrate that idea. This is the first tree that I'm going to show doing the air layer on. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I want to kind of rescue a tree that's in a little bit of trouble here. So if you look at the base of this apple, it's a grafted tree, it's a full dwarf, and you see this elephant's foot here? This is forming because the scion is so much more vigorous than the rootstock that they're not really getting along with each other. This is a bad pairing, okay? This is common with full dwarf and super dwarf trees and is the reason I don't prefer them. But if we look at this right there, and right there, and right there, and right through there, those are clusters of lenticels. This is a very good candidate for an air layering. Because of this, I don't worry too much. If I really want to get a variety in, I'll get it in whatever form that it comes in. Most commercial nursery stock is semi-dwarf, but even if it's dwarf or super dwarf, I can still get it. But we'll plant it and then immediately air layer off the top, or take wood off for grafting. So we're going to do that to this tree to make sure that we can preserve it. Okay, so this is the branch that we're going to air layer off of this apple tree. Now, the first thing we need to do is to make a cut, right? So we want the cut to be at least as long as the branch is thick, and I usually do a little bit longer than that, okay? So I'm going to go and ring around this with my little carving knife here. These little Sloyd knives are just the handiest things. If you've seen any of my carving videos, this is the same one I do there. And yes, I absolutely do just grab it for this sort of garden work. Makes for a little extra sharpening, but it's good. And now I'm going to shave through until I find the sapwood. So that is sapwood. This is the phloem tissue that we want to cut through. And there's the cork cambium in the green. Okay. So I'm just going to cut this away around this knot. Now, sometimes, especially here in the spring, once you get this started, find the bottom. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I wasn't all the way through the phloem on that one. There. Now I'm all the way through the phloem. Go slow, because we want to make sure that that sapwood is able to continue sending water up. So go slow, a little layer at a time, until you dig your way down to it. You've got time. Patience is good. Okay. Now, having cut all the way around, sometimes you can just get your fingernail in here and peel it off. Especially in the springtime. This one's being fairly cooperative that way. When you do that, guarantees that you won't get into the sapwood too bad. This one's half working. I'm going to need to do a bit more cutting. Apples will root just from regular semi-hardwood cuttings. Anything which roots from cuttings or tip layers is a good candidate for this as well. And if this particular air layer is successful, we'll have a nice big branch on its own roots to go and plant. So even after this full dwarf tree starts to decline, which it inevitably will, we have shorter lifespans than trees on their own roots. We'll have this variety still in the orchard. I think this is a Granny Smith, if I remember correctly. I planted it for my parents quite a while ago. Okay, there. Now we have removed the outer bark and the phloem, and we're down to an unmarred patch of sapwood. We're done with the knife for now. Now remember, this is uphill, this is downhill. Okay? So the hormone the roots produce, which comes up and stimulates branches, is going to come up to here and get stuck right in there, and you're going to get a poof of branches right from that spot. And then the hormone the leaves produce, which stimulates root growth, is going to come down this way, build up here, and you're going to get a poof of root development right in this region. Okay? So this is where we care. And I can see some lenticels sticking out right there, which is good. I'm just going to scrape some of this lichen off. You can see more lenticels right in there. Now, to give it a little extra chance, we're going to put some rooting hormone on here. I have some rooting powder, and I'm just going to use a little handful of this moss to moisten it. And this is a little tip I got from another YouTube channel called Heron's Bonsai. They do a lot. They have quite a few propagation videos that are worth checking out, but applying the rooting powder with a paintbrush like this. Don't know why I never thought about it, but I never thought about it. They thought about it, did a video on it, and I like the idea. I also like to cite my sources. So go check their propagation videos out too. They're a good channel. Okay, so we'll just dab some rooting powder on there. That's just a synthetic form of the hormone, so we're getting some of it there in place early. And now I'm going to get a bigger handful of this sphagnum moss and a piece of plastic. Okay. You're going to get a wad of moss. Doesn't have to be perfect at this stage. And we're going to cover this whole area. Now, the most important place for the moss to be is here where I put that rooting powder, where those lenticels are. Those lenticels are the entire thing that's going to make this process happen. Okay? This doesn't matter. That's going to go branches. This is where your roots are going to happen. Okay. The plastic I'm using here is just a cut up 1 gallon freezer bag. And now I'll bind up the bottom with some string. Just kind of quick half hitch there. Go rounds, tie it off. And when you're doing this, the first one doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to hold things together while you get it all adjusted. You can always come and put another string on there, right? So just get it on. Yeah, I'm going to open this end up a little bit because I want to stuff some more moss in there. This is a pretty big branch that we're trying to work with here, and I want to give it as good a chance as possible. Stuff a little more moss in there. Almost out of moss. I need to go get another bag. This is living sphagnum moss. I collect it myself, and that statement might get a couple people's hackles up, but I'm only collecting in small quantity for my own purpose. And when I collect from like a little clump of moss, I'll pull a few strands out and leave the rest of the clump alone. So after I'm done, you would never know that I had even been there collecting any. Very small amounts scattered over a very wide area, very sustainable. It's not going to hurt the moss population at all. I'm not going in with a bulldozer and hogging up huge quantities of this stuff. Just a little baggie at a time. Okay. And there, my hands were a little short, but I think that'll work. We have a prepared air layering. Now, to grow roots, this can be anywhere from less than 2 months to more than 2 years. Right? We'll be able to see the roots as they start to develop. I have different properties that I'm collecting some cuttings from. I'm going to continue working on these, and I will take you around and kind of give you a tour of some of the ones I prepared and some of the logic for why I'm choosing to propagate these certain species. Now, in that clip where I was showing the technique, I was talking about having a full dwarf fruit tree that I want to get on its own roots so that it can become a full-sized fruit tree. Okay? This is similar. All nurseries have a scratch and dent pile. Well, pretty much all nurseries have a scratch and dent pile, right? Trees come damaged from suppliers. Trees get damaged because a customer knocked them over, or branch fell out of another tree and hit it. Right, stuff happens to plants. Nothing's perfect. And And these get sold, at discounts, sometimes really good discounts. So anytime I'm in a nursery, I try to find the scratch and dent pile and make a beeline for it. Okay? This is one such tree. This is a really nice flowering crabapple. And it was on a scratch and dent pile because it's an ugly tree, right? It's got this big long branch just coming up and crossing over the whole rest of the tree. Right here, that's a girdle that goes halfway through. So as this grows, it's very likely to snap off there. That's a fairly profound weakness for a tree of this size. And there's another even worse girdle that's out of the frame right at the base of the root ball. Okay? So this has 3 major defects in it, and I got it off the scratch and dent pile. Now, most folks ignore these. Most folks lack the imagination to see what it can become, and they're only looking at what is it right now. The good news is you know how to air layer, and you're not one of those folks, so you can take advantage of finds like this. What I'm going to do with this tree, I've already put 1 air layer on here, because as I said, this big crossing branch needs pruned anyway. So I'm going to take that off. Once this either succeeds or fails, I will come back and I will put another air layer right here at this half girdle. I'll make it an all the way girdle, and we will get this section off on its own roots. And then I'll take the root ball and I will plant it so that it's 6 or 8 inches deeper than the girdle at the partial girdle at the base of the root ball. Now, just like when you plant a tomato plant deep, it'll grow roots out the side. Apples will do the same thing. So it will produce roots above the weakness in the trunk. It'll take a minute, but it will do it eventually, and it will be just fine once that happens. So from 1 scratch and dent ugly tree bought at a very good discount, I'm going to get 3 beautiful crab apples for our farm. So here I'm helping my family with some pruning chores, and this branch is going to be pruned off anyway. So I'm going to air layer it. This is another good reason to air layer. When you have larger branches like this that you're going to prune anyway, layer them instead of prune them. You'll get some extra trees. And back here, I've done the same thing on this big old water sprout. So when you're thinking about pruning, also be thinking about opportunities to take air layers out and expand your plantings. This is what a lot of people call a phoenix tree. A tree that is split in half and fallen in 2 directions or just been blown over in one, re-rooted, re-established itself, and rebuilt a new crown structure. This is also a very rare old variety of apple called a greening that is a root cellaring apple. You don't eat it when you pick it, you root cellar it, and it gets sweet as it's in storage. These used to be very, very important before you could just go to the grocery store and buy whatever apple you wanted all year long. Okay? So we're going to do a little air layering in this tree. It's a really wonderful way to save an old special tree and propagate it. And it's also going to give us a little insight into how trees grow and why this worked in the first place. So let me take you deeper into the structure of this and I'll show you why. So as we're getting into this phoenix tree here, you can see the tree this is the original trunk, it has fallen over. When that trunk goes from vertical to horizontal, you have a very similar hormone change to what we're doing with the air layering process. And this is a gigantic new root. So this new grounding point, new rooting juncture is actually supporting this tree more so than the original trunk where it split. And also, as we're looking at the structure of this, you can see all these water sprouts coming up. These are good things to prune anyway. So we can come in and we can make multiple air layerings here on all of these water sprouts, take these off, save and propagate this impossible to find variety, and make friends in the process. Because if I'm going to come in here and do 1 or 2 air layerings, I might as well do 3, 4, or 5 air layerings, and then we can all share. This is a really great way to get amazing plant material, make friends in the process. You'll get the plant material that you're looking for. Your friends will love you because you're sharing with them, and it's just a good way to be a good neighbor. and save a beautiful tree like this. The way these old trees live and thrive is just amazing. In addition to saving and propagating old varieties like that greening apple phoenix tree that we were just at, sometimes you just find things that are cool and you want to bring into your garden. So behind me here is a feral pear tree, and I'm struggling a little bit to identify it down to species. Some of its attributes make me think Pyrus communis, the common pear tree, the fruitful pear tree. Some make me think Pyrus spinosa, the almond leaf pear tree. And since those two are interfertile, it could be a mutt of the two. I know that there's one of the almond leaf not too far from here, and a small planting of edible pears not too far from where I'm standing too. So this could be a spontaneous pear hybrid. Either way, it's interesting and I want to explore it further. So I'm going to take some cuttings from it. I've already done so there around back. You can't see them from this angle, but that will allow me to bring some material from this tree into pots, into the garden, to study it, to look at it, to see what it's good for, and if I like it, keep it and add it to my plantings. So if you're finding this helpful, I would be most grateful if you gave it a thumbs up. The YouTube algorithm loves that and helps it know to show it to other folks, so I thank you for that. Now, up to this point, really all of the plants that I've been showing have been something in the rose family, the fruit trees and such. And that is the majority of what I'm working with this spring. But there's quite a few other plants that can be air layered. Anything that you can root from a cutting has a reasonable chance of being a successful air layer. And even some things which are very difficult to root from cuttings can be successful air layers. So free yourself up to experiment with this. You're out very little if it doesn't work, and you've gained a lot if it does. So some other things that I am tinkering with this year are things like this yew bush. This is a hedge I'm going to help my family prune back here later this year. But in the meantime, I'm going to need to take some of the thickness out, so I have branches I'm going to prune anyway, and I'm attempting an air layer on a few of them. We'll see how it goes. I have a few air layer attempts this spring on boxwood. I'm planning to try a couple of rhododendrons, maybe an azalea or two, maybe a couple other conifers just to tinker and see what it works, where it works and where it doesn't. I will share my results in a later video as we go to harvest them and take them to the next step. So I hope that you will subscribe and follow along, and I will see you next time here at Old Ways Rising Farm.